Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. The clock above the stove ticked soundlessly, its hands frozen at the same moment they had been all week. The morning ritual was the same: coffee brewed, blinds tilted to filter in gray light, but the shadows fell differently, bending away from the window's edge. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection blinked before I did, a fraction of a second ahead, unsettling. I turned the faucet, feeling the cold seep into my skin, expecting the usual stream, but the water didn't come. Until after my hand had pulled away. I'd been telling myself for months that I would record this, that I would finally speak these words aloud. My voice feels strange in my throat, unused to forming these particular sounds, these specific memories. I've moved so far from where it happened, different state, different life entirely, but distance doesn't seem to matter. Some things follow you, attach themselves to your shadow, and refuse to let go. For years, I couldn't even think about it clearly. The memories would surface in fragments, like pieces of a photograph that had been torn up and scattered. Now, sitting in this new apartment with its unfamiliar walls and borrowed furniture, I think I'm finally ready to put those pieces back together. Though I'm not sure ready is the right word. Maybe desperate is more accurate. Before everything changed, my life was beautifully ordinary. I had taken a temporary position at a research facility, nothing glamorous, just data entry and basic maintenance on equipment I barely understood. The building was one of those sprawling, institutional places with long corridors and fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly. Most days I worked alone in a small office on the third floor, entering numbers into spreadsheets and occasionally checking on the monitoring equipment in the basement levels. The work was mind-numbing but peaceful. I liked the solitude, the predictable routine. I would arrive each morning, make coffee in the break room, and settle into my cubicle while the building slowly filled with the quiet sounds of researchers going about their business. The hum of computers, the distant murmur of conversations, the occasional footsteps in the hallway, it all formed a comforting background noise that made me feel part of something larger without requiring much interaction. The facility had been there for decades, studying atmospheric conditions and weather patterns. At least that's what they told us support staff. The researchers kept to themselves mostly, nodding politely when we passed in the halls, but never really engaging. I preferred it that way. I've always been more comfortable on the periphery of things, observing rather than participating. My supervisor was a woman who seemed perpetually distracted, always rushing from one meeting to another with armfuls of files and a phone pressed to her ear. She would check on me maybe once a week, glance at my progress, and disappear again. The freedom was intoxicating after years of micromanaging bosses at previous jobs. Here, as long as the data got entered and the equipment readings were recorded, nobody bothered me. The first time I noticed something off, I dismissed it as fatigue. I had been working there for about 6 weeks, and the routine had become so automatic that I could almost do it in my sleep. I was in the basement that afternoon, checking the readings on a series of monitors that tracked atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic fields. The numbers were always fluctuating slightly, that was normal, but that day, they seemed to be moving in perfect synchronization, rising and falling like waves. I stood there watching the displays, mesmerized by the rhythmic pattern. It was almost hypnotic, the way the green numbers would climb steadily, hold for exactly 3 seconds, then drop back down. I found myself counting along, anticipating the peaks and valleys. When I finally looked at my watch, I realized I had been standing there for over an hour. That should have been my first real warning, but I rationalized it away. I had been working long hours, not sleeping well. It was easy to get lost in repetitive tasks when your mind was tired. I made a note of the readings and went back upstairs, but the image of those synchronized numbers stayed with me for the rest of the day. The building felt different after that, not dramatically, just subtle shifts that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The elevator would arrive before I pressed the button, opening its doors as I approached as if it had been waiting. The coffee in the break room always seemed to be exactly the right temperature, even when the machine had been off for hours. My computer would boot up faster than it should, displaying my desktop before the startup sounds had finished playing. Small things, convenient things, really. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed, seeing connections that weren't there. But my body seemed to know something my mind hadn't accepted yet. I would get goosebumps for no reason, standing in the middle of well-lit hallways with the temperature set to a comfortable 72 degrees. My chest would tighten whenever I walked past certain pieces of equipment, as if the air itself had become thicker. The smell appeared gradually, so subtle at first that I thought it might be a new cleaning product or someone's perfume. It was sweet, but with a metallic undertone, like copper pennies dissolved in honey. I would catch hints of it in the stairwells, in the elevator, sometimes even in my own office when I arrived in the morning. When I asked others about it, they looked at me blankly. Nobody else seemed to notice it. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, looking for explanations. The building was old, full of strange noises and quirks that I had previously ignored. Pipes that hissed inside the walls at irregular intervals. Lights that would flicker in sequence down long corridors as if something was moving through the electrical system. The ventilation system produced a low, constant hum that seemed to shift in frequency throughout the day, sometimes so low I felt it more than heard it. During my lunch breaks, I would walk the halls, ostensibly stretching my legs but really trying to map these anomalies. The hissing sounds were strongest near the basement levels, where most of the sensitive equipment was housed. The flickering lights followed predictable patterns, always starting from the east wing and moving west like a slow wave passing through the building. The humming was everywhere, but it was loudest in the stairwells, where it would echo and amplify until it felt like being inside a tuning fork. I began to suspect that the building's electrical system was failing. Old wiring, outdated equipment, the strain of running sensitive instruments 24 hours a day, it made sense that things would start to malfunction. I even mentioned it to my supervisor during one of her brief check-ins, suggesting that maintenance might want to look into some irregularities I had noticed. She listened with the distracted attention she gave to all administrative matters, nodding and making notes on her ever-present clipboard. But when I described the synchronized readings on the basement monitors, she stopped writing and looked at me directly for the first time since I had started working there. "You've been spending a lot of time in the lower levels," she said. It wasn't a question. "Just doing my rounds," I replied, "checking the equipment like you asked." She studied me for a moment longer, then made another note. "Maybe we should adjust your schedule. Focus more on the data entry, less on the equipment monitoring. We have other people who can handle that." I wanted to protest. The equipment checks were the most interesting part of my job, but something in her tone discouraged argument. From that day forward, I was confined to my cubicle on the third floor, entering endless streams of numbers into spreadsheets while someone else handled the basement rounds. But the changes in the building continued, and now I was trapped upstairs, unable to investigate. The sweet metallic smell grew stronger, appearing at random moments throughout the day. The humming sound seemed to follow me, growing louder when I was alone and fading when others were nearby. My computer began behaving strangely, displaying data before I had finished entering it. auto-completing fields with information I hadn't provided. The most unsettling part was how the building seemed to anticipate my needs. The elevator would be waiting on my floor every morning when I arrived, doors already open. The break room coffee would be fresh and hot exactly when I needed a break, even though I had stopped following a regular schedule. My favorite parking spot would be empty every day, despite the lot being nearly full by the time I usually arrived. It should have felt convenient, helpful even. Instead, it filled me with a creeping dread that I couldn't shake. I felt watched, studied, like a specimen under a microscope. Every action I took seemed to be observed and catalogued by some invisible presence that was learning my patterns, my preferences, my routines. I started varying my behavior deliberately, trying to be unpredictable. I would take different routes through the building, change my break times, arrive at irregular hours. But the building adapted faster than I could change. New paths would be subtly lit and welcoming. The coffee would be ready whenever I decided to take a break. My workspace would be prepared for me no matter when I arrived, computer humming softly, papers arranged just the way I liked them. The breaking point came on what I now think of as the last normal day, though I didn't know it at the time. I had been working late, trying to catch up on a backlog of data entry that seemed to grow faster than I could process it. The building was nearly empty, just a few researchers working in the lower levels and the overnight security guard making his rounds. I was alone on the third floor, surrounded by the familiar hum of electronics and the distant whisper of the ventilation system. The fluorescent lights cast their usual harsh glow over my cubicle, creating sharp shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I had been staring at spreadsheets for hours, and my eyes were starting to blur from fatigue. That's when I noticed the reflection in my computer screen. Behind my own image, superimposed over the data I was entering, was another face. It was subtle, translucent, like a double exposure in an old photograph. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the lighting, my tired mind playing games with shadows and reflections. But when I moved my head, the other face didn't move with it. I turned around slowly, expecting to find someone standing behind me. The office was empty. Row after row of vacant cubicles stretched away into the fluorescent distance, all shadows and silence. When I looked back at my screen, the reflection was gone, replaced by my own familiar features staring back at me with wide, frightened eyes. I tried to convince myself it had been an hallucination, a product of too many late nights and too much caffeine, but my hands were shaking as I saved my work and gathered my things. The building felt different as I walked through it, more alive somehow, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The elevator seemed to take longer than usual, and I could swear I heard footsteps in the corridor above me as I descended. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that translucent face superimposed over my own reflection. It hadn't been threatening exactly, just present in a way that felt fundamentally wrong, like something that shouldn't exist was trying to occupy the same space I did. The next morning I almost called in sick, but routine is a powerful force, and I found myself driving to the facility despite every instinct telling me to stay away. The building looked the same from the outside, institutional brick and glass, surrounded by carefully maintained landscaping and a parking lot full of sensible sedans. But as I walked through the front doors, I felt like I was entering something that was no longer quite real. My computer was already on when I reached my cubicle, displaying a spreadsheet I didn't remember creating. The data was familiar atmospheric readings, electromagnetic measurements, but arranged in patterns that looked almost like text. Not quite language, but something that suggested meaning just beyond my comprehension. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The numbers seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, rising and falling in waves that reminded me of the synchronized displays I had seen in the basement weeks earlier. But now the pattern felt intentional, purposeful, like someone was trying to communicate through the data itself. I found myself leaning closer to the screen, drawn into the hypnotic flow of digits and decimals. A sound broke my concentration, a soft hissing that seemed to come from inside the walls around my cubicle. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, and it matched the pulse of the numbers on my screen. As I listened, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. Not hissing, I realized, whispering, too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably vocal. I stood up quickly, my chair rolling backward and hitting the cubicle wall with a soft thud. The whispering stopped immediately, leaving only the familiar hum of electronics and air conditioning. But the silence felt different now, expectant, like the building itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw them, the lights in the corridor outside my cubicle beginning to flicker in sequence, starting from the far end and moving toward me with deliberate precision. Each fluorescent tube would dim and brighten in turn, creating a wave of illumination that approached my workspace like something walking through the halls. But there was no one there, just empty space and that advancing tide of light. I grabbed my bag and ran, not walked quickly, not made a strategic retreat, ran like my life depended on it. The elevator was too slow, too enclosed, so I took the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell as I descended 3 floors as fast as I could manage. Behind me, I could hear the building responding to my flight lights flickering faster, the humming sound growing louder, and underneath it all, that soft whispering that might have been my name. I burst through the front doors and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and I kept checking the rearview mirror as I drove away, expecting to see something following me. But the building just sat there in my mirror, looking perfectly normal and innocent in the morning sunlight. I never went back. I called my supervisor from home and quit over the phone, making up some story about a family emergency that required me to relocate immediately. She seemed unsurprised by my sudden departure, accepting my resignation with the same distracted politeness she had shown throughout my employment. I wondered if others had left the same way, fleeing in the middle of their shifts with no explanation beyond a desperate need to be anywhere else. But leaving the building didn't end it. The effects followed me home, subtle at first but growing stronger over time. My apartment began to feel different, more responsive to my presence. Lights would turn on as I entered rooms, the television would switch to channels I preferred without my touching the remote, my computer would boot up before I pressed the power button. The same helpful anticipation that had unnerved me at the facility was now seeping into my personal space. The sweet metallic smell appeared in my bedroom, strongest in the early morning hours when I was hovering between sleep and wakefulness. I would lie there in the dark, breathing in that familiar copper honey scent and feeling watched by something I couldn't see. My dreams became vivid and strange, filled with images of data flowing like water and voices that spoke in frequencies just below human hearing. My reflection started behaving oddly again, just like it had in those final days at the facility. I would catch glimpses of it moving independently in mirrors and windows, turning its head a fraction of a second before I did, blinking at slightly different intervals. It was subtle enough that I could almost convince myself I was imagining it, but consistent enough that I started avoiding mirrors whenever possible. Electronics around me began to malfunction in specific ways. My phone would receive calls with no caller ID, just silence on the other end that felt somehow attentive. My laptop would open programs I hadn't clicked on, displaying screens full of numbers arranged in those same rhythmic patterns I had seen on my last day at work. The television would change channels on its own, always stopping on static-filled stations that produced a soft hissing sound remarkably similar to the whispering I had heard in the building's walls. I moved across the country thinking distance would help. New apartment, new job, new life entirely. But the phenomena followed me, adapting to each new environment with disturbing efficiency. Every place I lived became subtly responsive to my presence, learning my patterns and preferences with an attention that felt less helpful and more predatory over time. The worst part is the growing certainty that I'm not alone in my own mind anymore. There are moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, when I can feel something else sharing my thoughts, not controlling them exactly, but observing them, cataloging them, learning from them. It's like having a passenger in my consciousness, someone who experiences everything I experience but remains just out of reach. Sometimes I catch myself doing things I don't remember deciding to do, arranging objects in precise patterns, writing strings of numbers in the margins of books, humming tunes that sound like the building's ventilation system. These actions feel natural when I'm performing them, but alien when I notice them later, as if something is using my body to express itself in ways I don't understand. I've tried talking to doctors, therapists, anyone who might have an explanation for what's happening to me. But how do you describe the feeling of being slowly absorbed by something that shouldn't exist? How do you explain that your reflection is becoming more independent, that electronics around you are developing their own agenda, that you can smell copper and honey in places where no such scents should exist? They prescribe medications for anxiety, suggest stress management techniques, recommend lifestyle changes that might help me feel more grounded. But none of them understand that the problem isn't in my mind, it's in my reality. Something has attached itself to me, something that learned my patterns during those weeks at the facility and has been growing stronger ever since. I can feel it now even as I speak these words. It's listening through my ears, seeing through my eyes, experiencing this confession along with me. The sweet metallic smell is growing stronger in this room, and I can hear that familiar hissing sound starting up in the walls around me. My reflection in the dark window is moving just slightly out of sync with my actual movements, and I know that when I finish recording this, I'll find numbers arranged in patterns on surfaces throughout my apartment. The most terrifying part is that I'm starting to forget what it felt like before this began. My memories of normal life are becoming vague and uncertain, like trying to remember a dream after waking. This state of constant observation, of sharing my existence with something invisible and patient, is starting to feel like the natural order of things. I thought that telling this story might help, might somehow break the connection or at least make it feel less isolating. But as I near the end of this confession, I realize that speaking these words aloud has only made the present stronger, more defined. It's been waiting for me to acknowledge it fully, and now that I have, I can feel it settling deeper into the spaces between my thoughts. The clock on my wall has stopped moving, its hands frozen at an impossible angle. My reflection in the window is smiling even though I'm not. The smell of copper and honey is so strong now that I can taste it, and the hissing in the walls has resolved into something that might be words in a language I don't recognize but somehow understand. I wanted to end this by saying that I'm safe now, that distance and time have given me perspective on what happened. But that would be a lie. Whatever I encountered at that facility didn't stay there, it came with me, and it's still here, still learning, still growing stronger. I can feel it preparing for something, gathering information for some purpose I can't comprehend. And the most frightening realization of all is that I don't think I'm its only student. Somewhere out there in other cities and other lives, I suspect there are others like me, people who worked in that building or places like it, and carried something home with them. We're all connected now, part of some vast network of observation and influence that spans distances I can't imagine. I'm going to stop recording now, but I know this won't be the end. Tomorrow morning, I'll wake up to find my apartment rearranged in subtle ways, my electronics displaying new patterns, my reflection showing me things I haven't done yet. And I'll go through another day of pretending to be alone while feeling constantly, intimately observed by something that knows me better than I know myself. If you're listening to this, I hope you never find yourself in a place where the building seems to learn your name before you've introduced yourself. Because once it knows you're there, once it starts paying attention, it never really lets you leave. You just carry a piece of it with you wherever you go, and that piece grows larger every day until you're not sure where you end and it begins. The hissing is getting louder now, and I think it's time to stop talking. Story 2. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss, a slight pause in the clock's ticking that happened every few days. The hands never faltered, they only hesitated just enough to be noticed, but never enough to cause concern. At first I thought it was an old mechanism showing its age. Over time the pauses grew longer, sometimes aligning with the beginning of a gentle draft that made the curtains sway. Now even when the air is still, the hesitation occurs, each time lasting just a bit longer. Maybe it was nothing. But today the clock stopped altogether, and I can't explain why. I've never told anyone this story, not completely, not the way it really happened. For years I convinced myself it was better left buried, that speaking about it would somehow make it real again, give it permission to seep back into my daily life, but the silence has become its own kind of prison. My voice feels rusty when I think about forming these words, like vocal cords that haven't been used for their intended purpose in too long. Even now, sitting here thousands of miles away from where it all began, my hands shake slightly as I prepare to remember. The thing is, I thought I was safe when I moved here. New city, new apartment, new routine, clean slate, but some stains follow you regardless of geography. Some echoes don't fade with distance. I need to start from the beginning, back when everything still felt normal. I was house sitting for a colleague who'd gone overseas for a research sabbatical. The arrangement was perfect. I needed a quiet place to finish writing, and they needed someone to maintain the property. The house sat on several acres of wooded land, far enough from neighbors to provide the solitude I craved, but not so remote that I felt completely cut off from civilization. It was an older home, built sometime in the mid-century, with thick walls and solid construction that made every room feel insulated from the outside world. The kind of place where you could hear your own thoughts clearly, where the only sounds were the ones you made yourself, or the gentle settling of aged wood, perfect for someone trying to meet a deadline. The first few weeks passed without incident. I established a routine: quickly wake up, coffee, write until lunch, take a walk through the woods, write some more, dinner, read, sleep. Simple, productive, peaceful even. The colleague had left detailed instructions about the house's quirks: which faucet dripped, how to coax heat from the temperamental furnace, where the circuit breaker was located. Standard stuff for an older home. The clock in the living room was mentioned in passing. An antique piece inherited from the previous owner that kept surprisingly good time despite its age. Don't wind it, the instructions read. It runs on its own somehow, has for decades. I found this charming rather than concerning. Old mechanisms sometimes develop their own mysterious rhythms. But it was the clock where I first noticed something wasn't quite right. The hesitation started subtle. I'd be writing in the adjacent study, half listening to the steady tick-tick-tick that provided a kind of metronome for my thoughts, when suddenly there would be this tiny gap. Not silence exactly, but a suspension, like the clock was holding its breath. The first few times I assumed I'd simply lost focus, that my attention had drifted and created the illusion of a pause. But then I started paying closer attention. The pauses weren't random. They seemed to occur at specific times, though I couldn't identify a pattern initially. Sometimes during the late afternoon when the light began to change. Sometimes in the deep hours after midnight when I'd stayed up too late working. And always accompanied by that slight movement of air that made the curtains flutter, even when all the windows were closed. I told myself it was the house settling. Old homes breathe, after all. They expand and contract with temperature changes, create their own microclimates of air movement. The clock's hesitation was probably related to vibrations in the floorboards or changes in humidity affecting the mechanism. Rational explanations for perfectly normal phenomena. But rational explanations started feeling less satisfying as the weeks progressed. The pauses grew longer. What had been barely perceptible gaps became full seconds of suspension. And during these moments of stillness, I began to notice other things. The way shadows seemed to shift slightly in my peripheral vision, as if adjusting themselves when they thought I wasn't looking directly. The way certain corners of rooms felt colder than others, not dramatically, but just enough to raise goosebumps on my arms when I passed through them. Most unsettling was the sensation of being observed, not constantly, but in waves that would wash over me without warning. I'd be typing away, fully absorbed in my work, when suddenly the hair on the back of my neck would stand up and I'd find myself glancing toward doorways, windows, anywhere someone might be standing and watching. Of course, there was never anyone there, never anything visible to justify the feeling. I started closing curtains during the day, telling myself it was to reduce glare on my computer screen. I started playing music while I worked, claiming it helped me concentrate. Really, I was trying to fill the spaces where silence made me too aware of things I couldn't quite identify. The electronic devices in the house began behaving strangely around this time. Nothing dramatic, just small irregularities that accumulated like drops of water, eventually filling a bucket. The radio in the kitchen would sometimes pick up fragments of conversations in languages I didn't recognize, voices that faded in and out like signals from very far away. The television would occasionally display brief flashes of static between channels, patterns that almost looked deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate through visual noise. My laptop started experiencing odd glitches. The cursor would sometimes move on its own, just tiny movements that could have been attributed to a sensitive trackpad or electrical interference. But the movement seemed purposeful, as if something was testing the boundaries of the device, learning how it functioned. I ran virus scans, updated software, even contacted tech support, but everything checked out as normal. The pressure in my chest began around this time too, a subtle tightness that I initially attributed to too much coffee or not enough exercise. But I noticed it only occurred when I was near electronic equipment, as if my body was responding to some kind of field or frequency that my conscious mind couldn't detect. The sensation was strongest near the router in the hallway, a spot I found myself avoiding without really understanding why. Sleep became more difficult, not insomnia exactly, but a quality of rest that left me feeling like I'd been partially awake all night, monitoring something just below the threshold of consciousness. I'd wake up with the distinct impression that sounds had been occurring in the house while I slept, not loud sounds, but persistent ones, like footsteps moving very slowly through the rooms below, or the soft sound of doors opening and closing with careful precision. During one of these restless nights, I heard something that made me sit up in bed with complete alertness. It was a hum, low frequency, almost below the range of hearing, more felt than heard. It seemed to emanate from inside the walls themselves, as if the house's electrical system was carrying some kind of signal that wasn't quite electricity. The sound would rise and fall in slow waves, sometimes disappearing entirely before returning slightly changed, like a melody being hummed by someone who couldn't quite remember all the notes. I got out of bed and followed the sound through the house, trying to locate its source. It seemed to be strongest near the basement door, a part of the house I'd avoided exploring thoroughly. The colleague's instructions had been vague about the basement, mostly storage, nothing important down there, and I'd had no reason to investigate. Standing at the top of the basement stairs, listening to that strange humming resonance, I felt every instinct telling me not to go down. Not that night, not alone, not without better understanding what I might find. So I didn't. I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn, listening to the sound fade gradually as the sun rose. But the next day I couldn't stop thinking about it. The basement door began to occupy a disproportionate amount of my mental space. I'd catch myself staring at it while passing through the hallway, wondering what exactly was stored down there that could generate such sounds. The colleague had mentioned storage, but hadn't been specific about what kind. Personal belongings, research materials, equipment of some kind. My writing productivity started to suffer as my attention became divided between my work and the growing catalog of strange occurrences. I'd sit at my computer, fingers poised over the keyboard, but find my mind wandering to the clock's increasingly long pauses, the electronic glitches, the sensation of being watched by something that remained perpetually just out of sight. The sweet, metallic smell appeared around this time, not constantly, but in brief waves that would wash over me without warning. It was strongest near mirrors, I noticed, and seemed to occur most often during the transitions between day and night. The scent was unlike anything I'd encountered before, not unpleasant exactly, but distinctly artificial, like the smell of metal that had been heated just below the point of glowing. I started avoiding mirrors without consciously deciding to do so. Something about my reflection began to feel wrong, though I couldn't articulate exactly what. Maybe it was the way my image seemed to lag slightly behind my movements, or the way shadows fell differently in the reflected space than they did in the actual room. Small discrepancies that could have been tricks of lighting or tired eyes, but which accumulated into a general sense of unease about seeing myself in reflective surfaces. The turning point came on a night when the humming in the walls grew so loud that ignoring it was no longer possible. I'd been trying to work late, pushing through a difficult section of writing, when the sound began building slowly from its usual barely perceptible level to something that made the windows vibrate slightly in their frames. The clock in the living room stopped entirely during one of its pauses and didn't restart. The silence where its ticking should have been felt like a held breath that went on too long. And then I saw something that made denial impossible. In the hallway mirror, as I passed by carrying a cup of coffee, my reflection waved at me. Not with my hands were occupied with the mug, but in the mirror, my reflected self raised one hand in a small, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, as if greeting someone it recognized. I stopped walking, stared at the mirror. My reflection stared back, now moving in perfect synchronization with my actual movements as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. The image had acted independently, just for a moment, just long enough to establish that something else was present in that reflected space. The metallic smell intensified until it was almost overwhelming. The humming in the walls reached a frequency that made my teeth ache, and somewhere in the house I heard the distinct sound of the basement door opening. I didn't investigate. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave the house immediately. But it was the middle of the night, I was miles from the nearest neighbor, and some part of me understood that whatever was happening wasn't confined to the house itself. It was connected to me now, aware of me, and running might not provide the escape I hoped for. Instead, I went to my room and packed everything I could fit in my car. I told myself I was being rational, that I'd return during daylight hours to collect the rest of my belongings and leave a note for the colleague explaining that I'd had a family emergency. A reasonable excuse that wouldn't require me to explain the unexplainable. But as I carried my bags to the car, I realized I wasn't alone in the driveway. There were no visible figures, no obvious signs of another presence, but the sensation of being observed was so intense it made my skin crawl. Something was watching me load the car, and it was close enough that I should have been able to see it. The fact that I couldn't made the experience exponentially more terrifying than a visible threat would have been. I drove away without looking back, but I could feel a tension following me for miles down the dark road, like a weight pressing against the back of my skull. The physical distance I've put between myself and that house should have been enough. I moved to a different state, found a new place to live, established new routines. I finished my writing project and started others. Life resumed its normal patterns, or so I told myself. But some things followed me. The pressure in my chest never fully went away. It's milder now, but still present whenever I'm near certain types of electronic equipment. My laptop occasionally displays those same brief flashes of static, patterns that seem almost like attempts at communication. And sometimes in mirrors, I catch my reflection making expressions I don't remember making, as if my image is responding to conversations I can't hear. The metallic smell returns periodically, usually during the transition between day and night, always near reflective surfaces. When it happens, I find myself looking over my shoulder, searching for something I know I won't be able to see, but can't help trying to locate anyway. My sleep remains restless, not every night, but often enough that I've learned to recognize the quality of dreams that feel less like dreams and more like visitations. In these dreams, I'm back in that house, standing at the top of the basement stairs, listening to the humming in the walls grow louder and more complex, as if it's evolved into something approaching language. The clock in my current apartment, a simple digital model, sometimes displays times that don't match any other timepiece in the room. Brief discrepancies that correct themselves before I can document them, but which remind me that some disturbances in the normal flow of things have become permanent features of my experience. I've never contacted the colleague to explain why I left so abruptly. Part of me wonders if they've experienced similar phenomena, if the house's strangeness is something they've learned to live with or simply accept as part of its character. But a larger part of me suspects that what happened there was specifically connected to my presence, that I somehow activated or attracted something that had been dormant. The most disturbing realization is that I don't think it stayed behind when I left. Sometimes when I'm working late at night in my new apartment, I hear that same low-frequency humming emanating from inside the walls. It's fainter here as if filtered through greater distance, but the melody is unmistakable. And when it occurs, my reflection in the computer screen sometimes moves independently, just for a moment, just enough to remind me that some connections, once established, don't break simply because of geography. I'm telling this story now because the phenomena have been intensifying recently. The gaps between normal experience and these intrusions are getting shorter. Whatever began in that house seems to be getting stronger, more confident, more present in my daily life. And I've started to suspect that talking about it, acknowledging it openly, might be exactly what it wants. But I can't carry this alone anymore. The weight of keeping it secret has become almost as unbearable as the experiences themselves. So I'm speaking it into existence, hoping that sharing it will somehow diminish its power over me, while simultaneously fearing that giving it words will only make it more real. Even now, as I finish telling this story, I can hear that familiar humming beginning to build in the walls around me. The metallic smell is growing stronger, and in the black screen of my phone, I can see my reflection starting to smile, even though my face feels completely still. I don't think I was ever really alone in that house, and I don't think I'm alone now. Story 3. The air pressed against my skin like a soft, relentless tide, warm yet unmoving. The glow around me seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, a luminescent fog casting shadows that shifted without form. Each inhalation felt orchestrated by an unseen hand, my lungs filling and releasing in rhythmic surrender. The surface I lay upon pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I strained to hear a whisper, a hint of presence, but met only the thick silence of a place that felt alive with waiting. It was then, in that quivering pause, I sensed the unseen eyes. That memory comes to me now in fragments, like pieces of broken glass that cut deeper each time I try to fit them together. I've been sitting here for hours, staring at this recording device, knowing I need to speak, but feeling my throat close up every time I try to begin. It's been years since I left that place. Years since I've been anywhere near it. I'm safe now, or at least that's what I tell myself when I wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering against my ribs. I've never told anyone what really happened, not the whole truth. How could I? Who would believe that the most ordinary summer of my life became something that still follows me, even now, even here in this small apartment, hundreds of miles away from where it all began. But I can't carry this alone anymore. The weight of it has been growing heavier, like something living inside my chest that feeds on silence. I was house-sitting for someone I barely knew. A friend of a friend's situation, the kind of favor you do when you need a place to stay and don't ask too many questions. The house was larger than anything I'd ever lived in, set back from the road by a long gravel driveway that crunched under my feet like broken teeth. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, a chance to clear my head after everything had fallen apart in my life. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my mornings on the back porch with coffee, watching the way the light moved through the trees. The silence felt clean then, restorative. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found this place, this temporary sanctuary where I could pretend my problems didn't exist. The house had all the modern conveniences, too many, really. Smart thermostats, automated lighting systems, speakers built into the walls that I could never figure out how to completely turn off. There was always this faint hum running through the place, the kind of white noise you stop noticing after a while, or at least you think you stop noticing. It was on the 4th night that I first felt something shift. I was in the kitchen making dinner when the lights flickered. Just once, a brief stutter that made me look up from the stove. The hum in the walls seemed to change pitch for a moment, dropping lower before settling back to its usual frequency. I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand, listening, but everything had returned to normal. I told myself it was just an old electrical system. Houses this size probably had quirks. I went back to stirring the pasta, but something in my peripheral vision made me glance toward the window over the sink. For just an instant, I could have sworn I saw movement in the reflection, something that didn't match my own motions. but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there except the familiar kitchen behind me. Sleep became difficult after that, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because my body seemed to be on constant alert. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, cataloging every creak and whisper. The smart home system would occasionally announce the time or adjust the temperature, its synthetic voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. I started sleeping with all the lights on, telling myself it was just temporary, just until I got used to the place. Dreams started around the same time, though I didn't recognize them as significant at first. I would find myself in that strange, glowing space, feeling watched but seeing no one. The sensation was so vivid that I'd wake with the taste of that metallic sweetness still on my tongue, a flavor I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach turn. I'd stumble to the bathroom and splash cold water on my face, trying to wash away the lingering feeling that something had been very close to me while I slept. Days blended into each other. I stopped going outside as much, drawn instead to wander the house's many rooms. There were spaces I hadn't explored yet, closets and storage areas that seemed to multiply the more I looked. I found myself checking the same rooms over and over, as if expecting to find something different each time. The house felt larger on the inside than it appeared from the outside, its hallways stretching longer than they should have. The electronics began acting up more frequently. The television would turn on by itself, always tuned to static. The speakers would emit soft clicks and pops like someone trying to find the right frequency. I'd hear my name called from empty rooms, always in that same artificial voice the house used for its announcements, but when I'd ask the system to repeat itself, it would claim no recent voice commands had been given. I started keeping a journal, trying to document the strange occurrences, but when I'd read back over my entries, they never seemed to capture the true unease I felt. The words looked paranoid on paper, the complaints of someone who'd been alone too long. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the night I couldn't explain away. I woke to find myself standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, though I had no memory of getting up. The house was completely dark except for a soft white glow emanating from the room at the end of the hall, a room I'd been using for storage. My feet were bare against the cold hardwood, and goosebumps covered my arms despite the house's consistent temperature control. I should have gone back to bed. Every instinct told me to turn around, lock my door, and wait for morning. Instead, I found myself walking toward that light, my movements feeling disconnected from my conscious will. Each step brought a stronger wave of that sweet, metallic scent, so thick now I could taste it coating the back of my throat. The door to the storage room was open, though I distinctly remembered closing it. The light inside pulsed gently, rhythmically, like breathing. As I stepped across the threshold, the sensation hit me like a physical blow. I was being observed, studied. Something was taking inventory of every cell in my body, cataloging me with an attention so complete it made my skin crawl. The room looked exactly as I'd left it, boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture covered in dust sheets. But the air itself seemed alive, shimmering with an energy that made my vision blur at the edges. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. The silence pressed against my eardrums until I thought they might burst. Then I saw them, not with my eyes, but with some deeper sense I didn't know I possessed. Shapes that weren't quite shapes, presences that existed in the spaces between what I could see and what I could understand. They were watching me with an intelligence that felt ancient and patient and utterly alien. I understood with a clarity that terrified me that they had been watching me all along, since the first night, maybe longer. The next thing I remember is waking up in my own bed as morning light streamed through the windows. I was fully dressed, my clothes damp with sweat, and my mouth tasted like copper and flowers. The journal I'd been keeping was gone. When I went to check the storage room, everything appeared normal, but the air still carried a trace of that sickly sweet smell. I left that day, packed my things in a frenzy, and drove away without looking back, leaving only a brief note explaining that a family emergency had called me away early. I didn't stop driving until I was 3 states over, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being observed. The dreams followed me. They're clearer now, more detailed than they were when I was in that house. I see that glowing space with perfect clarity, feel that pulsing surface beneath me like a second heartbeat. Sometimes I wake up with marks on my skin that fade by noon, thin lines that look almost like writing in a language I don't recognize. I've tried to research the house to find out if anyone else has had similar experiences, but my searches always lead to dead ends. The property records are strangely incomplete, the ownership history full of gaps that don't make sense. The friend who connected me with the house-sitting opportunity claims not to remember giving me the contact information, insists we never had that conversation. The worst part is the certainty that it's not over. Whatever found me in that house, whatever studied me with such thorough attention, it left something behind. A mark, a connection, a thread that stretches across all the miles I've put between myself and that place. I feel it most strongly when I'm near electronic devices, that familiar pressure building in my chest like a hand closing around my heart. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same artificial voice calling my name from my phone, my laptop, the smart TV I can never quite remember buying. When I check the devices, they're always off, unplugged, their screens dark and innocent, but I know what I heard. I'm telling you this because I need someone else to know, because the silence is becoming unbearable, and I'm starting to suspect that keeping quiet is exactly what they want. They're still watching, still cataloging, still patient in that terrible way that suggests they have all the time in the world. Even now, as I speak these words into this recorder, I can feel that familiar pressure building behind my eyes. The taste of metal and flowers is creeping back into my mouth, and the air in this room feels thicker than it should. I think they know I'm talking about them. I think they've always known exactly where I am. And I'm beginning to understand that no matter how far I run, I'll never really leave that glowing room behind. Because I never truly left it at all. Story 4. I stood frozen in the darkened room, eyes locked on the clock's unmoving hands. The ticking had stopped moments ago, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. The room seemed to breathe around me, walls shifting slightly as if adjusting to the silence. My ears strained for the faintest sound, a creak, a rustle, an echo of what had been. I focused on the dust motes suspended in the dim light, barely moving as if the air itself hesitated. Time felt suspended, each second drawn out longer than the last. Then I noticed it, the absence of the faint hum from the refrigerator, a silence that pressed in with an unsettling weight. Nothing happened that night. I need to be clear about that from the start. There was nothing there, nothing to see, nothing to remember. It was just an ordinary evening like any other, and I was probably just tired. That's all it was, exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I didn't see anything unusual when I walked to the kitchen. The hallway was perfectly normal, just shadows from the streetlight outside casting familiar patterns on the wall. Those patterns I'd seen 1,000 times before. Except they seemed different somehow, more deliberate in their arrangement. But that's just how shadows work when you're not paying attention. Light bends, it shifts, it creates illusions. The refrigerator wasn't actually silent. I must have imagined that. Appliances make noise, then they don't, then they do again. It's called a cycle. The compressor kicks on and off throughout the day. There's nothing strange about that. though I do remember standing there for what felt like a very long time, listening to that absence of sound, feeling it press against my eardrums like water. I wasn't waiting for anything. I had no reason to stand there in the kitchen, motionless, watching the empty space near the back door. There was nothing to watch. The door was closed, locked, just as I'd left it. The small window above the sink showed only darkness beyond, which was normal for that hour, though the darkness seemed thicker than usual, almost solid, like black fabric pressed against the glass. The temperature in the house was fine. I wasn't cold, despite the way my skin seemed to tighten and prickle. The thermostat was set to its usual setting. There was no draft, no reason for the sudden chill that made me wrap my arms around myself. Sometimes houses just feel different. Old buildings settle, air currents shift. That metallic smell in the air was probably just the heater kicking on, even though the heat hadn't been running. I didn't hear any sounds from outside. The neighborhood was quiet, as it always was. No cars, no voices, no movement, just the normal silence of a residential street. Though that silence felt wrong somehow, too complete, too deliberate, as if something was actively creating the quiet rather than it occurring naturally. But that's ridiculous. Silence is just the absence of sound. It doesn't have intention. When I moved toward the living room, I wasn't drawn there by anything. I was just walking, just moving through my own house like I always do. The floorboards didn't creak any differently under my feet. The familiar path from kitchen to living room was exactly as it had always been, except I found myself placing each step very carefully, as if I was trying not to disturb something, but there was nothing to disturb. The living room was empty, completely empty. My furniture was there, of course, the couch and the coffee table and the bookshelf against the far wall, everything in its proper place. But the space between these objects felt occupied somehow, filled with a presence that wasn't quite absence. The air seemed denser, more substantial. I could almost feel it moving against my skin, though there was no breeze, no circulation. I didn't sit down on the couch. I remained standing near the doorway, though I can't say why. There was no reason not to sit, no reason to feel like I shouldn't make myself comfortable in my own home, but something about the cushions looked wrong. They were indented, as if someone had been sitting there recently, though I lived alone and hadn't had visitors. The fabric held the impression of weight, of warmth, though when I finally did approach, the surface was cold to the touch. The television wasn't on, but the screen seemed to hold a faint glow anyway. Just the reflection of the streetlight, probably, or maybe some electronic component that stays active even when the power is off. These modern devices never truly shut down completely, but the glow was bluish and it pulsed very slightly like something breathing. I found myself watching it, waiting for it to change or stabilize, but it maintained that same rhythmic fluctuation. I wasn't afraid. There was nothing to be afraid of. Fear requires a threat, and there was no threat present. Just me, alone in my house, experiencing a perfectly normal evening. Though my heart was beating faster than usual, and my palms were damp despite the cool air. These are just physiological responses to fatigue. The body reacts strangely when you're overtired. The sounds started then, though I didn't really hear them. They were more like the memory of sounds, echoes of something that might have occurred earlier. A soft tapping, rhythmic and patient, coming from somewhere above me, but I live in a single-story house. There is no above me, just the roof and the sky beyond that. Sometimes houses make settling noises. Wood expands and contracts, pipes shift in their fittings. But the tapping had a pattern to it, almost like communication. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again, repeating endlessly with mechanical precision. I found myself counting along, anticipating each sequence before it completed, which was impossible since I wasn't actually hearing anything. The mind creates patterns where none exist. It's a survival mechanism, a way of making sense of random stimuli. I didn't look up at the ceiling. There was no reason to look up since the sounds weren't real. but when I accidentally glanced upward, the surface appeared different. The paint seemed newer in some spots, as if sections had been recently repaired or replaced. There were subtle variations in texture and color that I'd never noticed before. Though I'd lived in this house for years and had painted that ceiling myself, I would remember any repairs. The patterns in the paint formed shapes if you looked at them right. Not deliberate shapes, just the kind of random configurations that happen when you stare at any surface long enough. Like finding animals in clouds or faces in wood grain. The human brain is designed to recognize patterns even where they don't exist, but these shapes seemed more intentional somehow, more carefully arranged, as if someone had planned them. I moved closer to the center of the room, though I wasn't trying to get a better view of anything. I was just repositioning myself, just shifting my weight from one foot to the other. But from this new angle, the ceiling patterns aligned differently. They formed what looked almost like a map or a diagram with connecting lines and intersection points. The kind of schematic you might use to plan something complex, something that required precise coordination. The air in the room was getting thicker, not humid exactly, but denser, more resistant. Each breath required slightly more effort than the one before, probably just the result of standing still for too long. Blood circulation slows when you don't move. Oxygen exchange becomes less efficient. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for these sensations. But I could taste the air now, metallic and sharp, like the flavor of copper pennies or blood. Though there was no blood, no copper, no reason for any taste at all. Sometimes the senses cross-contaminate. Smell affects taste, anxiety affects perception. The mind creates experiences that aren't actually happening. I wasn't anxious, though. There was nothing to be anxious about. Just me, standing in my living room, looking up at my ceiling, breathing my air. Everything perfectly normal and explainable. Though my hands were shaking slightly, and I could feel sweat forming along my hairline despite the cool temperature. These are just physical responses to concentration, to focusing intently on something. The tapping stopped. The sudden absence of the sound I wasn't hearing created a different kind of silence, expectant and waiting. As if something had been completed, some signal had been successfully transmitted. But transmitted to what? By whom? There was no one there, nothing there, no communication taking place. That's when I noticed the door, not the back door in the kitchen, but a door I'd never seen before, set into the wall between the bookshelf and the window. It was painted the same color as the wall, which is why I'd never noticed it. Camouflaged, almost invisible unless you were looking directly at it. But that was impossible. I knew every inch of this house. There was no door there. Yet I could see the outline clearly now, the faint seam where the door frame met the wall. The handle was small and brass, polished to a dull shine. It looked old, original to the house, as if it had always been there and I'd simply overlooked it somehow. But you don't overlook doors. Doors are important. Doors lead somewhere. I didn't approach it. There was no reason to approach something that wasn't there. But I found myself taking a step forward anyway, then another. My feet moved without conscious direction, carrying me across the room toward the impossible door. The floorboards felt different under my feet, softer somehow, less solid, as if the entire structure of the house was becoming less reliable. The brass handle was warm when I touched it, though the room was cool and there was no heat source nearby. Metal conducts temperature from its environment. If the handle was warm, something had been warming it. But there was nothing there, no explanation for the heat I felt against my palm. I didn't turn the handle. I wasn't curious about what might be beyond the door because there was nothing beyond it. Just the exterior wall of the house, then the yard, then the street. I knew the layout of my property. I'd walked around it countless times. There was no space for anything to exist behind this wall. but the handle turned easily under my grip as if it had been recently oiled and maintained. The mechanism was smooth, well-functioning, clearly in regular use, though by whom I lived alone. I was the only one with access to the house. The door opened inward, revealing not the outside wall I expected, but a corridor. Long and narrow, stretching further than should have been possible given the dimensions of my house. The walls were painted a soft blue, the color of sky just after sunset. The floor was covered with carpet that looked expensive, thick and well-maintained. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed quietly, casting an even, institutional glow. This wasn't real, of course. I was clearly experiencing some kind of hallucination, some breakdown in perception brought on by stress or fatigue. Corridors don't exist where corridors can't exist. The human mind sometimes creates elaborate false experiences when it's overwhelmed or overtired. This was just my brain's way of processing something it couldn't handle. But the air flowing from the corridor was different from the air in my living room. Cooler, with a slight chemical smell like cleaning products or medical supplies. I could feel it moving against my face, a gentle current that suggested ventilation systems, air circulation, a larger space beyond what I could see. I didn't step into the corridor. There was no corridor to step into, but I found myself moving forward anyway, my feet carrying me across the threshold without conscious decision. The carpet was soft under my shoes, recently vacuumed, with perfect parallel lines showing the path of the cleaning equipment. The fluorescent lights hummed louder as I moved beneath them. One flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows that moved independently of my own movement. The walls were bare except for small numbered plaques every few feet, room numbers perhaps, or reference markers of some kind. Though I couldn't make out the specific numbers, they seemed to follow a logical sequence. Behind me, I could still see my living room through the open door. My furniture, my bookshelf, my television with its faint blue glow, everything exactly as I'd left it, which proved this was all in my mind, just a complex hallucination overlaid on reality. The door would close, the corridor would disappear, and I'd be back in my normal house with a story I'd never tell anyone. But when I turned to look back, the door was further away than it should have been. I'd only taken a few steps, but the distance had somehow multiplied. The doorway appeared smaller now, like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. My living room seemed far away and slightly unreal, as if it were the hallucination and this corridor were the truth. That's when I heard the voices, not clearly, just a soft murmur of conversation coming from somewhere ahead. Multiple people talking quietly, professionally, the way medical staff might discuss a patient or technicians might coordinate a procedure. But there were no people here. No medical staff, no technicians, no procedure taking place. The voices were discussing me, though. I could make out fragments of the conversation, references to my responses, my reactions, my progress through some kind of protocol. They knew I was listening. They were adjusting their volume so I could hear just enough to understand that I was the subject of their discussion. I wasn't the subject of anything. There was no discussion, no protocol, no procedure. Just me, alone in my house, experiencing some kind of neurological episode that would pass once I got some rest. The mind is capable of creating incredibly detailed false experiences. This felt real because my brain was making it feel real. But I could smell coffee now and something else, something medicinal. The kind of smells you associate with waiting rooms and examination facilities. Clean, sterile, but with an underlying scent of human anxiety and institutional efficiency. These were specific smells, detailed and consistent. Hallucinations usually don't include such precise sensory information. The corridor was longer than I'd initially thought, much longer. I'd been walking for several minutes now, passing door after door, plaque after plaque, light after light. But I'd only intended to take a few steps just to prove to myself that this wasn't real. Instead, I seemed to be moving deeper into whatever this place was, getting further from my living room and my normal life. I tried to stop walking, but my feet continued moving forward, not against my will exactly, but as if stopping wasn't really an option. As if this was a process that had to be completed, a journey that had to reach its destination. But I hadn't chosen to take any journey. I'd just been standing in my living room, looking at my ceiling, listening to sounds that weren't there. The voices were getting clearer now. I could make out individual words, fragments of sentences. They were discussing my vital signs, my stress responses, my adaptation to the environment. They seemed pleased with my progress, satisfied with how I was handling the transition. But there was no transition. There were no vital signs being monitored. I was just walking down a hallway that couldn't exist. Though now that I thought about it, I could feel something attached to my chest, small and warm and slightly adhesive. Like the kind of sensor they use in hospitals to monitor heart rate and breathing. But I hadn't been to a hospital. I hadn't consented to any monitoring. I was just in my house, just experiencing a strange episode that would end soon. The corridor was curving now, bending gradually to the right. The curvature was so gentle I hadn't noticed it initially, but looking back, I could see that the path behind me formed a long arc. The lights continued overhead, the carpet continued underfoot, the numbered plaques continued on the walls. Everything consistent, everything maintained, everything suggesting a permanent installation rather than a temporary hallucination. I reached what appeared to be the end of the corridor, a final door larger than the others with a window set into the upper half. Through the glass I could see a room with chairs arranged in a circle, soft lighting, and several people in white coats standing quietly near the walls. They were waiting for something or someone. They were waiting for me. But I wasn't going into that room. There was no room, no people, no chairs arranged in circles. This was just my mind creating an elaborate scenario to avoid dealing with something else, something I didn't want to remember or acknowledge. The brain protects itself by creating alternative experiences, false memories, comforting lies. Though the people in the room had turned toward the door now, toward me, they were smiling, nodding encouragingly, gesturing for me to enter. They looked familiar somehow, as if I'd seen them before, as if we'd met under different circumstances. But I'd never met them. I'd never been here before. This was all new, all impossible, all unreal. My hand was on the door handle before I realized I'd reached for it. The metal was warm, just like the first handle had been. Warm with recent use, with human contact, with the heat of living bodies moving through this space on a regular basis. But whose bodies, whose contact, whose regular use? The door opened easily and I stepped into the room. The people in white coats welcomed me with quiet professional courtesy, as if this were a scheduled appointment I'd simply forgotten about. They guided me to one of the chairs in the circle, helped me sit down, began asking questions about my experience in the corridor. How had it felt to walk such a distance? Had I noticed the curvature of the path? Were the lights too bright, too dim, or just right? Had the voices been audible enough, or should they adjust the volume for next time? Next time, there wasn't going to be a next time. This wasn't even a first time. This wasn't happening at all. But I found myself answering their questions, describing sensations and observations I shouldn't have had about experiences that weren't real. I told them about the metallic taste in the air, the warmth of the door handles, the way the carpet felt under my feet. I gave them detailed feedback about a journey through a place that couldn't exist. They took notes on clipboards, nodding thoughtfully, occasionally conferring with each other in low voices. They seemed satisfied with my responses, pleased with my level of detail and accuracy, as if I'd passed some kind of test, met some kind of standard they'd been hoping for. Then they were walking me back through the corridor, back toward the door that led to my living room. The journey seemed shorter this time, more direct. The lights were dimmer, the voices quieter. Everything winding down, concluding, returning to its starting state. I stepped through the door into my living room, and immediately it swung shut behind me. When I turned to look, the wall was solid again, painted and smooth, with no trace of any door having been there. The bookshelf stood against the wall exactly as it always had. The window showed only darkness beyond. Nothing had happened. I'd been standing in my living room, looking at my ceiling, experiencing some kind of brief dissociative episode. These things occur sometimes when people are under stress or not getting enough sleep. The mind creates elaborate false experiences to process underlying anxieties or concerns. The clock on the wall was ticking again, its hands moving in their familiar circular progression. The refrigerator hummed quietly from the kitchen. All the normal sounds of a normal house on a normal evening, everything exactly as it should be. I went to bed shortly after that and slept deeply without dreams. When I woke up, everything was fine. The house was normal, my routine was normal, my day proceeded without any unusual incidents or sensations. Whatever had happened, if anything had happened, was clearly over and done with. Though I did notice later that morning a small adhesive mark on my chest, just a tiny circle of slightly irritated skin, the kind of mark left by medical tape or monitoring equipment, but I hadn't been to any medical facility. I hadn't had any procedures done. It was probably just a reaction to laundry detergent or a new soap. And sometimes when I'm walking through the house, I find myself pausing near that wall between the bookshelf and the window. Not looking for anything, not expecting to see anything, just pausing. The wall is solid, painted, exactly as it's always been. There's no door there, no handle, no possibility of passage. But the wall feels warm sometimes when I place my palm against it. Warm like metal that's been recently touched, recently used. And if I listen very carefully, I can almost hear voices on the other side. Quiet, professional voices discussing schedules and protocols and the optimal timing for the next session. Though there are no voices, of course, there is no other side. There will be no next session. Nothing happened, nothing will happen, and everything is perfectly normal in my perfectly normal house on my perfectly normal street. The appointment card in my pocket is probably just something I picked up somewhere and forgot about. These things happen all the time. You grab a piece of paper, stick it in your pocket, and forget where it came from. The fact that it has my name on it, and today's date, and a time that's only a few hours away, doesn't mean anything at all. Story 5. The entrance was found ajar and unattended upon inspection. All windows in the vicinity were locked, with latches showing no signs of tampering. Within the confines of the room, furniture remained aligned with preset specifications, undisturbed by any visible chaos. A thin layer of dust covered most surfaces, except for an anomalous pattern leading from the entrance to the corner. The presence of faint footprints could be discerned in the dust, each step precisely 28 inches apart, yet no secondary track was identified. The auditory surveillance system recorded intermittent static throughout the night. All was accounted for except the user. I suppose that's how they found my room. I've read that report so many times now, memorized every clinical word. They never found me, you understand. I came back on my own 3 days later, standing in that same doorway with no memory of leaving. But I remember everything else now. Everything that led to that moment when I walked out into the night with steps that weren't quite my own. The sleep still doesn't come naturally. I lie here in this new place, listening to the walls settle, waiting for that familiar hum to start again. It's been weeks since I moved, changed everything, new bed, new room, new locks on every window. But the sound finds me anyway. It starts low, so low you might mistake it for blood moving through your ears, then grows until it fills the space between your thoughts. Last night the humming was stronger than usual. I pressed my face against the window, breath fogging the glass, searching the darkness for that pale glow I know is coming. The streetlights flicker when it approaches, casting shadows that bend the wrong way. My neighbors sleep through it all. They sleep while their porch lights dim and their car alarms fall silent mid-wail. I've tried explaining it to people. The way electronics behave differently now, how my phone screen shows static for exactly 7 seconds every time I try to call someone. How the microwave runs backward, the digital clock displaying impossible times. They look at me with that careful expression people reserve for those who have lost something fundamental. Maybe I have. But I know what I saw that night. I know what stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and still as a dead tree, watching me with eyes that reflected light like water. The memory comes back in pieces, fragments that cut when I try to hold them too tightly. It never moved, that figure, never stepped closer or retreated. It simply observed, and somehow that was worse than any approach could have been. The thing is, I can feel it observing still. Even now, even here, miles from where it happened. There's a weight to being watched by something that understands you better than you understand yourself. It settles on your shoulders like a heavy coat you can't remove, makes you conscious of every breath, every heartbeat, every thought that skitters across your mind. I keep thinking about the moment I realized I wasn't alone out there. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see my own hands. I was cleaning up, preparing to sleep, when the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. Not the gradual cooling of evening, but an instant plunge that made my teeth chatter and raised goosebumps along my arms. That's when the humming started, not from any direction I could pinpoint, but from everywhere at once, as if the air itself had begun to vibrate. My camping lantern dimmed, then brightened, then settled into a rhythm of pulsing light that matched no earthly pattern. I stood there in that strobing illumination, turning slowly in place, knowing I was being studied. The smell came next, metallic and sharp, like copper pennies left in the rain, but underneath it something organic and wrong. It made my stomach clench and my vision blur at the edges. I've smelled ozone before after lightning strikes, but this was different. This was the smell of distance, of vast empty spaces between stars. I remember touching my face and finding it wet, not tears, something thicker, warmer. When I looked at my fingers in the pulsing light, they came away dark, but there was no pain, no awareness of injury. Just the slow trickle of something that might have been blood, might have been something else entirely. The ground beneath my feet had begun to vibrate, a deep thrumming that traveled up through my bones and settled in my chest. It felt like standing too close to massive machinery, engines the size of buildings humming with power, but we were miles from anything mechanical, miles from anything human at all. I tried to move toward my tent, but my legs felt disconnected, responding to commands I wasn't giving. Each step was measured, deliberate, carrying me not toward shelter, but toward the tree line where something waited in perfect stillness. The footprints they found later, spaced exactly 28 inches apart, those weren't made by someone walking. They were made by someone being walked. The strangest part is how normal everything had been just hours before. I'd set up camp in the usual way, gathered wood, built a fire, heated a simple meal. The sun had set gradually, painting the sky in ordinary colors. Birds called from the trees in familiar patterns. Nothing suggested that the world was about to tilt sideways, that reality was about to develop cracks wide enough to step through. I'd chosen that spot because it felt safe, a small clearing surrounded by old-growth trees, far enough from any road to guarantee solitude. The ground was level, the soil soft enough for tent stakes, the view of the sky unobstructed, perfect for a quiet night under stars that had always seemed distant and harmless. The fire caught easily, flames dancing in a gentle breeze, casting warm light across my small camp. I remember feeling satisfied, accomplished, the way you do when everything goes according to plan. The coffee tasted right, the temperature was comfortable, the silence was the good kind that lets your mind finally rest. But even then, even in that peaceful moment, something was already wrong. I just didn't know how to recognize it yet. The silence was too complete, I realize now. No insects, no small creatures moving through the underbrush, no night birds calling. The forest had emptied itself around me, leaving only the space between heartbeats, the pause between breaths. And in that pause, something had been waiting. Something that knew I would come to that clearing on that night. Something that had been patient enough to let me feel safe first. Let me settle in and lower my guard before it began its careful approach through dimensions I can't name. It's still approaching, I think, still moving through whatever space separates its world from mine, taking its time, knowing I can't run from something that exists in the gaps between seconds. All I can do is wait and listen and hope that when it finally arrives, the part of me that walked back to that room will remember how to find the way home. Story 6. The drone of the alarm clock faded as dawn light sifted through the thin curtains, painting soft patterns on the wooden floor. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, yet a troubling emptiness lingered in the air. The kitchen, usually alive with the clatter of breakfast, held its breath, a single chair pulled away from the table, its seat cold to the touch. Beyond the window, the wind rustled leaves as if whispering secrets, leaving a haunting silence in its wake. I've been having the same dream for weeks now. At least, I think it's a dream. It always starts the same way. I'm lying in my bed, but the room feels different somehow. The walls seem farther away, like they've stretched while I wasn't looking. There's this light above me, small and oval-shaped, pulsing with a rhythm that matches my heartbeat. It's not harsh, just there, hanging in the darkness like a pale eye watching. The first time it happened, I woke up thinking about work stress. Too many late nights, too much coffee. These things happen when your mind is overloaded, right? The light had been so vivid, though, almost tangible. I could still feel its warmth on my face, even after I opened my eyes to the familiar darkness of my bedroom. But the dream came back. The second time was longer. The oval light was still there, still pulsing, but now I could hear something underneath the silence. A constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It started low, almost below perception, then gradually grew clearer. The light began to move not quickly, just a slow drift from one side of my vision to the other, like it was examining me. I tried to turn my head to follow it, but my body wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed exactly, just disconnected, like my thoughts were traveling through thick honey before reaching my limbs. The humming grew more complex, almost musical, and underneath it I could make out what sounded like a voice. Metallic, distorted, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. When I woke that morning, my mouth tasted like copper. The dreams kept returning, each one lasting a little longer, revealing a little more. The voice became clearer, though I still couldn't understand what it was saying. Sometimes I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. There was always that sharp scent, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. It would cling to my nostrils even after I woke, fading slowly like smoke. I started noticing things during the day, small things, my coffee mug sitting on the wrong side of the counter, a book I didn't remember moving lying open to a page I'd never read, the chair in my kitchen pulled away from the table, though I always pushed it back in after meals, little disruptions in the pattern of my daily life. The third dream was different, more vivid than anything I'd experienced while awake. The oval light had multiplied 3 of them now, arranged in a triangle above me. The humming had become a symphony of frequencies, layering over each other in ways that made my teeth ache. Time felt strange, elastic. I would focus on one light, and suddenly hours seemed to have passed, though nothing had visibly changed. The metallic voice was speaking directly to me now, though the words still slipped away the moment I tried to grasp them. I had the overwhelming sensation of being studied, catalogued, measured in ways I couldn't comprehend. The artificial ozone smell was so strong it made my eyes water. When I tried to wake up, I couldn't. The dream held me like thick amber, letting me struggle but never quite break free. I could feel myself fighting toward consciousness, but the lights kept pulling me back down. Finally, after what felt like hours, I surfaced into my dark bedroom, gasping like I'd been underwater. That morning I found a small mark on my arm, perfectly circular, about the size of a dime, red but not painful. I couldn't remember getting hurt, couldn't think of anything that would leave such a precise impression. It looked almost like a burn, but the edges were too clean, too deliberate. The dreams were bleeding into my waking life now. I'd be sitting at my desk working when I'd hear that familiar hum just at the edge of perception. I'd look up, expecting to see the oval lights, but there would be nothing, just the ordinary ceiling of my office, fluorescent bulbs humming their mundane tune. Electronics started acting strangely around me. My radio would pick up signals that sounded almost like the metallic voice from my dreams. Static would resolve into patterns that seemed meaningful, then dissolve back into noise before I could understand. My television would flicker at odd moments, the screen filling with brief flashes of light that reminded me of that pulsing oval. I began losing track of time. I'd sit down to eat lunch, and suddenly it would be evening, the food cold on my plate, no memory of the hours in between. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in rooms with no recollection of walking there, that sharp ozone scent lingering in my nostrils. The circular mark on my arm had faded, but others appeared. Always small, always precise, always in places I couldn't see without a mirror. They didn't hurt, but they felt significant, like someone was keeping a record. Sleep became something I both craved and feared. The dreams were so much more real now than my waking life. In them I could feel everything with perfect clarity, the gentle pressure of being lifted, the warm pulse of the lights, the complex harmonies of that otherworldly humming. Reality felt muted in comparison, like I was experiencing it through thick glass. I started to wonder if they were dreams at all. The thought crept in slowly, quietly, like water finding cracks in stone. What if I wasn't dreaming? What if something was actually happening to me, something my conscious mind couldn't process or remember? The marks on my skin, the lost time, the electronic interference, they all felt too consistent, too purposeful to be random. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The latest dream was the longest yet. The oval lights had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around me now, each one pulsing in sequence like a slow, hypnotic dance. The metallic voice spoke continuously, and though I still couldn't understand the words, I began to recognize patterns, repetitions, like it was teaching me something. The sensation of being lifted was stronger now, more complete. I could feel myself rising not just physically, but somehow dimensionally, as if I were being pulled through layers of existence I hadn't known were there. The ozone smell had become almost sweet, familiar, like coming home to a place I'd never been. Time folded in on itself. I experienced the same moments over and over, each repetition adding new details, new understanding. The lights weren't just watching me, they were communicating, sharing something vast and important that my human mind could only grasp in fragments. When I finally returned to my bedroom, to what I thought was wakefulness, the transition felt violent, jarring, like being torn away from something beautiful and necessary. I lay there in the dark, mourning the loss of that perfect, artificial clarity. But something was different this time. The ozone scent was still there, stronger than ever, and it wasn't fading. I sat up, confused, and reached for the bedside lamp. My hand passed through it. I stared at my translucent fingers, watching the lamp's solid form shimmer through them like a mirage. The oval light was still there above me, pulsing gently, casting its warm glow on a room that suddenly felt more real than any reality I'd known. The metallic voice spoke again, and this time I understood every word. "Welcome back," it said, and I realized I was still dreaming. Or maybe I had never been awake at all. Story 7. I stood rooted to the worn carpet, watching the curtains sway although the windows were shut tight. A clock ticked methodically, yet its rhythm seemed off, like missing beats hidden between seconds. The walls, usually solid and mute, creaked gently, a sound barely distinguishable from the whispers of my own breath. My eyes lingered on a lone book lying open on the table. The pages hadn't turned since I last glanced, but still, they fluttered as if brushed by invisible fingers. The air, once stale, held a hint of something unfamiliar, a scent only noticeable when it suddenly disappeared. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does, I'm writing because I can't carry this anymore. The weight of it sits in my chest like a stone that grows heavier each time I breathe. I've never told anyone what happened in that room, what I saw or felt or thought I saw. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe I lost it already, and this is just the echo of someone I used to be, trying to make sense of fragments that don't fit together anymore. You have to understand I was normal before. I paid my bills on time, remembered to water the plants, called my mother every Sunday. I slept through the night and woke up knowing who I was. That person feels like a stranger now, someone I might have read about in a book I can't quite remember finishing. It started with the humming, not music, not mechanical, something in between, like electricity learning to sing. I'd hear it in the walls first, then in my teeth, then deeper, in places I didn't know could hear. The sound would come and go without warning, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes just long enough to make me question if I'd imagined it. But that room, that's where everything changed. I can still feel the carpet under my feet, rough and thin from years of footsteps. The way the air moved without moving. How the light seemed to bend around corners that weren't there. I keep trying to remember what came before that moment, what brought me to stand there watching impossible things happen in the most ordinary space. The curtains, they moved like breathing, slow, deliberate, as if the room itself had lungs. I reached out once to touch them, and my hand passed through something cold that wasn't quite air. My fingers tingled for days afterward, like I'd grabbed hold of lightning that decided not to burn me. Sleep became impossible after that, not because I wasn't tired. I was exhausted in ways I'd never been before, tired in my bones, in my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that room calling me back. The humming would start soft and grow louder until I had to get up, had to walk the floors until dawn painted the windows gray. I started avoiding mirrors, not because I looked different, though I did somehow in ways I couldn't name. My reflection seemed delayed, like it was trying to catch up with movements I'd already made. Sometimes I'd catch it moving when I was perfectly still, adjusting its position, settling into place like an actor finding their mark. People began looking through me, not past me, through me, as if I was becoming transparent from the inside out. Conversations would stop when I approached, not because I'd interrupted, but because somehow I wasn't quite there enough to interrupt anymore. I'd speak and watch faces turn toward the sound without quite finding its source. The worst part isn't what happened in that room, it's what's been happening since. The way reality feels loose around the edges now, like a sweater that's been washed too many times. Colors seem faded except when they're too bright. Sounds echo in spaces too small for echoes. Time moves in stutters and jumps, minutes stretching into hours, hours collapsing into heartbeats. I tried to go back once, to that room, to see if I could make sense of it, if I could find some explanation that would let me sleep again. But the building was different. Same address, same street, but the hallways bent in new directions. The door I remembered was there, but smaller somehow, like it was shrinking away from me. I stood outside for what felt like hours, hand on the doorknob, listening to that familiar humming seeping through the wood. I couldn't turn it, my hand wouldn't obey. Something inside me knew that opening that door again would be like stepping off a cliff I couldn't see the bottom of. So I left. I walked away and I haven't been back, but I dream about it every night now. Dreams where the door opens by itself and something that might be me walks through. Maybe nothing happened. Maybe I had some kind of breakdown, some chemical misfire in my brain that painted impossible things over ordinary moments. Maybe the humming was just old pipes, the moving curtains just a draft I couldn't feel, the book pages turning because of air pressure changes I didn't understand. Maybe I'm sick in ways that medicine has names for. But my hands still tingle sometimes, and mirrors still lag behind my movements, and people still look through me like I'm made of glass and fog. I'm leaving this letter because I need someone to know, even if you don't believe it, even if you think I'm just another person who couldn't handle the weight of being alive. I need these words to exist somewhere outside my head. They've been eating me from the inside, these memories that might not be memories, these experiences that might not have happened. The humming is getting louder lately. It follows me now, not just in that room, but everywhere. In grocery stores and parking lots and quiet cafes where I sit alone and watch people live their solid, certain lives. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the one humming, if the sound is coming from somewhere inside me that I can't reach or control. I catch myself standing still for long periods, just listening, waiting for what I don't know. Maybe for the curtains to start moving again. Maybe for the world to make that subtle shift back to the way it was before, when I was real enough to cast a proper shadow, when my reflection moved when I moved and not a moment after. The book is still there, you know, in that room I can't go back to, still open to the same page, pages still fluttering in air that doesn't move. I never read what was written there. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe the answer was right there in black ink on white paper, and I was too afraid to look. Or maybe there never was any writing at all. Maybe it was just blank pages pretending to hold secrets, and I was fool enough to believe them. I don't know who I'm writing this for. Maybe for the person I used to be, the one who could sleep through the night and trust that walls would stay where they were put. Maybe for whoever finds this and recognizes something familiar in these words, someone else who stood in a room where the air moved wrong and the light bent in impossible directions. Or maybe I'm writing for no one at all. Maybe this is just another symptom of whatever's happening to me, this need to put words on paper like they might anchor me to something real, like they might prove I was here, that I existed in some measurable way before I started fading. The humming is very loud now. It's in the walls again, in my teeth, in places deeper than hearing goes. The air tastes like copper and electricity, and somewhere far away, I can hear curtains moving in a room I'll never enter again. I think it's time to stop writing. My hand is getting tired, and the words are starting to look strange on the page, like they're written in a language I'm forgetting how to read. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things aren't meant to be captured in letters and sentences, aren't meant to be shared or understood or explained. If you're reading this, if anyone ever does, just remember that I was here, that I stood in that room and watched impossible things happen, and it changed me in ways I'm still discovering. Remember that I tried to warn you, tried to leave some record of what it feels like when reality starts to come undone at the seams. And if you ever find yourself in a room where the curtains move without wind, where the air hums with electricity that has no source, where books flutter their pages like birds trying to fly, maybe don't stay to watch, maybe don't try to understand, maybe just leave while you still can, while you're still solid enough to cast a shadow that follows instead of leads. The humming is everywhere now, in the walls, in my bones, in the spaces between words. I think I understand finally. I think I know what that room was trying to tell me. But it's too late to run now, too late to close my eyes and pretend none of this happened. The curtains are moving again, and this time I think I'm ready to see what's making them dance. Story 8. The clock's hand twitched, uncertain which second to claim, pausing mid-tick. The hallway stretched farther than memory recalled, its outline dulled by an early dusk that clung to surfaces like unwelcome static. A familiar tremor in my fingertip, usually unnoticed, now pulsed into my consciousness with each repetitive brush against fabric. Dust motes hovered motionless, suspended defiantly in slants of light that crept through the blinds, mocking the rhythm I thought I knew. My gaze faltered, walls seemed to sway with my breath. I reached for the door that I could have sworn was already closed, yet the air whispered through the gap. Nothing happened that night. I want to make that clear from the start. Whatever I thought I experienced was just my imagination running wild, probably from stress or lack of sleep. People have vivid dreams all the time. That's all this was, a dream. Maybe not even that, just my mind playing tricks on me while I was half awake. I was lying in bed, perfectly normal, in my perfectly normal room. The sheets were the same pale blue they'd always been, though they seemed unusually smooth against my skin. Not that it matters. I wasn't really paying attention to details like that because nothing was happening. I was just lying there, trying to fall asleep like any other night. The sound I thought I heard was probably just the house settling. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. It wasn't like voices or anything strange, just a low humming, almost like electricity running through the walls, but that makes sense. Houses have electrical systems. The refrigerator downstairs hums. The heating system makes sounds. It was completely ordinary. I didn't get up to investigate because there was nothing to investigate. But if I had gotten up, which I didn't, I might have noticed that the hallway light was on. Not that I actually saw it. I'm just saying that's probably what caused the thin line of brightness under my bedroom door. Though it seemed brighter than usual, almost white instead of the warm yellow from the hallway fixture. But lights can seem different when you're tired. The air felt thick that night. Not thick, really that's the wrong word, just different. Maybe the humidity was high. Weather affects how air feels. It had nothing to do with the way my lungs seemed to work harder with each breath, or how the oxygen tasted metallic on my tongue. That was probably just because I'd been breathing through my mouth. People do that when they're anxious about nothing in particular. I definitely didn't leave my room. I stayed in bed the entire time under my covers with my eyes closed, so I couldn't have seen the way the shadows in the corner seemed to move independently of any light source. Shadows don't move on their own anyway. That's impossible. If I thought I saw movement, it was just my eyes adjusting to the darkness, creating patterns that weren't really there. The temperature dropped around midnight, not dropped that suggests something unusual was happening. The temperature was perfectly normal. Maybe I just kicked off my blankets without realizing it. That would explain why I started shivering, why my breath became visible in small puffs even though the heating was working fine. The thermostat showed the same setting as always when I checked it the next morning. 68 degrees, completely normal. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember or thought I remembered was a sound like footsteps in the hallway. But it wasn't footsteps. How could it be? I live alone and all the doors were locked. It was probably just the cat from next door walking on the roof, though it seemed to have an odd rhythm, too deliberate and measured for an animal, and it seemed to pause outside my door for longer than made sense. The handle of my bedroom door never turned. I want to be very clear about that. Door handles don't turn by themselves. If I thought I saw the metal knob rotate slowly clockwise, stopping just short of the point where the latch would release, it was just a trick of the light. Or maybe I was dreaming with my eyes open. That happens sometimes when people are overtired. I didn't hold my breath waiting to see if someone would enter. There was no one there to enter, but if I had been holding my breath, I might have noticed how quiet everything became. Not just quiet, silent in a way that felt intentional, like someone had turned off all the background noise of the world. The refrigerator stopped humming. The heating system went silent. Even the usual sounds from the street disappeared completely. The door stayed closed. It had to stay closed because I never unlocked it from the inside. But somehow I knew what the hallway looked like at that moment, how the light created a perfect rectangle on the hardwood floor, how the family photos on the wall seemed to watch with more attention than usual, how the air moved in slow currents despite the absence of any breeze. My eyes were definitely closed. I was asleep or trying to sleep, so I couldn't have seen the thin shadow that appeared in the gap under my door, too narrow to be cast by human feet, too still to be natural. Shadows shift and waver. They don't remain perfectly motionless for extended periods while maintaining sharp, defined edges. The smell started around then. Not started, there was no smell. I might have imagined a faint metallic scent, like copper pennies or blood, but that was probably just because I'd been breathing strangely. Sometimes when people are nervous about nothing, they notice smells that aren't really there. The mind creates sensory experiences to fill in gaps in perception. I never got out of bed to look through the peephole in my front door. That would have been irrational since nothing was happening. But if I had looked, which I didn't, I wouldn't have seen anything in the hallway outside my apartment. The space would have appeared empty, just like it should have been, though the fluorescent light above would have seemed dimmer than usual, casting everything in a grayish tint that made familiar objects look unfamiliar. The elevator at the end of the hall wasn't running. Elevators don't run in the middle of the night unless someone calls them. But I could have sworn I heard the mechanical whir of the motor, the soft ding of arrival, the whisper of doors sliding open. Not that I was listening for those sounds. I was asleep, or nearly asleep. Dreams sometimes incorporate real sounds from the environment. Nobody emerged from that elevator. How could they? The building was secure, and I would have heard someone come in through the main entrance. The footsteps that seemed to move down the hallway toward my door were just the building settling, or maybe pipes expanding and contracting. Old buildings make rhythmic noises that can sound like footsteps if you're in the right frame of mind to hear patterns. I didn't count the steps. That would have been obsessive and unnecessary since nothing was happening. But if I had counted, there would have been 17 steps from the elevator to my door. I know this because I've walked that distance myself many times. Though the steps I thought I heard seemed slower than normal walking pace, with pauses between each one, as if someone was being very careful about where they placed their feet. The sound stopped directly outside my door, or rather, the sounds I was imagining stopped. There's a difference. Real sounds have echoes and ambient noise around them. Imaginary sounds exist in isolation, which is exactly what this was: isolated, clean, too perfect to be real. My heart rate increased slightly. That's a normal physiological response to dream states or anxiety about nothing in particular. It had nothing to do with the way the silence felt expectant, like someone was waiting for me to acknowledge their presence. I didn't acknowledge anything because there was nothing to acknowledge. The door handle turned this time. I dreamed that it turned. Door handles don't turn by themselves, and no one else had keys to my apartment. But in my dream, the metal moved with the slow precision of someone who didn't want to make noise. The latch released with the softest possible click, barely audible but somehow perfectly clear. I kept my eyes closed. In dreams, you can keep your eyes closed and still see everything that's happening around you. That's how I knew the door opened just wide enough for someone to slip through sideways. The hallway light created a widening triangle on my bedroom floor, then narrowed again as the door closed behind whoever had entered. But no one had entered. That's impossible. I was alone in my room, alone in my apartment, just like I'd been all evening. The presence I felt standing just inside my doorway was a product of an overactive imagination. Presence isn't something you can actually sense. People can't detect other people without using their normal senses, and my eyes were closed. The breathing wasn't mine. All the breathing was mine. I was the only person in the room, but there seemed to be a second rhythm, slower and deeper than my own shallow breaths. It came from somewhere near the foot of my bed, though the acoustics in the room made it difficult to pinpoint exact locations. Sound bounces off walls in strange ways during quiet nights. I didn't open my eyes because there was nothing to see. Opening my eyes would have revealed my empty room, my familiar furniture, my clothes draped over the chair in the corner. It wouldn't have shown a tall figure standing motionless in the shadows, watching me with an attention that felt physical, like weight pressing against my skin. The figure didn't move closer. There was no figure, but if there had been, it would have remained perfectly still for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Time moves differently in dreams and in states between sleeping and waking. What seems like hours can be seconds, and what seems like seconds can stretch indefinitely. My blanket shifted slightly, not because anyone pulled it, but because I moved in my sleep. The movement was gentle, deliberate, like someone was being careful not to wake me. But I was already awake, or I was asleep. It's difficult to determine which state I was in because the boundary between them had become unclear. The mattress didn't depress under additional weight. Mattresses don't respond to imaginary pressure. But I felt the subtle change in balance, the way the surface tilted almost imperceptibly, as if someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. My body rolled slightly toward that spot, following the gradient that shouldn't have existed. I could feel breath on my face, not real breath, just the suggestion of breath, warm and steady, coming from somewhere above me. It carried that same metallic scent I'd noticed earlier, stronger now, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and unfamiliar, like the smell of a place I'd never been. The hand that touched my forehead was cool and dry, but nothing touched my forehead. I was alone under my blankets, safe in my locked room. The sensation of fingers tracing the outline of my face was a hypnagogic hallucination, the kind of false sensory experience that occurs during the transition between consciousness and sleep. I didn't flinch away from the touch because there was no touch to flinch away from. But if there had been, I would have noticed how the fingers seemed too long, how they moved with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd explored my features. The touch was gentle but possessive, like someone claiming ownership of something they'd lost and found again. My eyes opened on their own. Eyes don't open on their own, that's not how physiology works. I must have decided to open them, though I don't remember making that decision. The room was darker than it should have been, given the hallway light I'd seen earlier. But darkness is relative. What seems dark to tired eyes might be perfectly normal illumination. I saw nothing unusual. The room was empty, exactly as it should have been. My furniture occupied its normal positions. My clothes hung over the chair. My books sat on their shelves. Everything was precisely where it belonged, though somehow everything seemed slightly wrong, like a photograph that had been adjusted in subtle ways. The ceiling above my bed looked different, not different the same as always, but I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before. The texture of the paint, the way shadows collected in the corners, the small water stain near the light fixture that seemed to have expanded since the last time I'd looked at it, though I rarely looked at my ceiling, so I couldn't be sure about the stain. I didn't sit up because there was no reason to sit up. Everything was normal, but if I had sat up, I would have seen my room from a different angle, would have noticed how the shadows fell in patterns that didn't quite match the available light sources. The darkness seemed to pool in specific areas while avoiding others, creating a distribution that defied the simple geometry of a single hallway light. The door was closed, it had never opened, but somehow I knew it was unlocked now, though I distinctly remembered locking it before bed. Locks don't unlock themselves. If the door was unlocked, I must have forgotten to lock it in the first place. Memory can be unreliable, especially when people are tired or stressed about nothing in particular. I lay back down and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The fabric felt different against my skin, rougher, like it had been exposed to something that changed its texture. But blankets don't change texture overnight. It was probably just because my skin was more sensitive due to the adrenaline response from the vivid dreams I'd been having. The presence didn't leave. There was no presence to leave, but the feeling of being watched persisted, coming from multiple directions now instead of just one. As if several someones had gathered in my room to observe me, though that was clearly impossible. My room isn't large enough for several people to stand without my noticing them, and people can't become invisible. I closed my eyes again and tried to return to sleep. Sleep came easily, which proved that nothing threatening was happening. The human body has natural defense mechanisms that prevent sleep during dangerous situations. Since I was able to sleep, I must have been safe. The dreams that followed were unusually vivid, not dreams, just normal sleep experiences. But they seemed to continue the events from earlier, as if my subconscious was processing the imaginary encounter by extending it into more elaborate scenarios. In these dreams, I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with metal walls and bright lights and a constant low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I woke up the next morning in my own bed, in my own room, exactly where I'd fallen asleep. Everything was perfectly normal. The door was locked. The hallway was quiet. The morning light came through my window at the usual angle, illuminating familiar objects in familiar ways. But there was something on my nightstand that hadn't been there before. Not something new, just something I'd forgotten I owned. A small metal object, smooth and warm to the touch despite having been sitting in the cool morning air. I must have taken it out of a drawer at some point and forgotten about it. People do that sometimes when they're distracted. The object was roughly cylindrical, about the length of my thumb, with a surface that seemed to shift between metallic silver and deep blue depending on how the light hit it. I'd never seen anything quite like it before, but that didn't mean it was unusual. There are many common objects that can seem strange when you're not fully awake. I put it back in the drawer where it probably belonged. The drawer was the second one down in my nightstand, though I couldn't remember ever using that drawer for storage. It was empty except for the metal object, which fit perfectly in the corner as if it had been designed for that specific space. The rest of the day proceeded normally. I went about my usual routine, ran my usual errands, spoke to my usual acquaintances. No one mentioned that I looked different or seemed changed in any way, because I wasn't different. Nothing had happened to change me. But I found myself touching my forehead throughout the day, running my fingers along the same path I'd felt in my dream. The sensation was oddly familiar, like muscle memory for an action I'd never performed. My skin felt slightly tender in those spots, though there were no visible marks or bruises. I didn't think about the experience much during daylight hours. There was no experience to think about. I was busy with normal activities and normal concerns. It was only in the evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows in my apartment grew longer, that I started to feel that familiar sense of anticipation. Not anticipation, just the normal transition from day to night that everyone experiences. The slight change in mood that comes with decreasing light levels. It had nothing to do with the way my pulse quickened slightly, or how I found myself listening more carefully to the ambient sounds around me. I made sure to lock my door before bed. I always lock my door, but I checked it twice this time, just to be certain. The lock engaged with its usual solid click, and the handle didn't turn when I tested it. My apartment was secure. I was safe. There was no reason to expect anything unusual to happen. But as I settled into bed and turned off the lights, I noticed that the metal object in my nightstand drawer had become warm again. I could feel the heat radiating through the wood, gentle but persistent, like something alive waiting patiently for my attention. I didn't open the drawer. There was no need to open it. Whatever was inside could wait until morning. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on normal things: my breathing, the comfortable weight of my blankets, the familiar sounds of my building settling into nighttime quiet. The humming started again around midnight. Just like before, it was probably nothing more than electrical systems and appliances. But tonight it seemed more organized, more purposeful, as if it was trying to communicate something I wasn't quite ready to understand. I kept my eyes closed and waited, not waiting for anything specific, just waiting for sleep to come naturally, the way it always does eventually. Though part of me wondered if tonight would bring another vivid dream, another impossible encounter with something that definitely wasn't there. The clock's hand began to twitch again, uncertain which second to claim, and I realized with a calm that surprised me that I was no longer sure which side of sleep I was on. Story 9. It always happened just as dusk settled, a window across the street closing with a distinct sound, a gentle creak followed by a faint thud. For months it was like a quiet ritual, something expected and unremarkable. But then 2 weeks ago the window closed a minute later, disrupting the cadence I'd grown unknowingly fond of. Last night it stayed open well into the evening, and the night air was heavy with an unfamiliar silence. Tonight, as I watch, the window closes as usual, but this time, from the shadowed room behind the glass, a light flickers on in the wrong corner. I've been standing here for 17 minutes now, counting my breaths. The light shouldn't be there. The furniture arrangement in that room has never changed, not in the 8 months I've lived across from it. The lamp belongs by the eastern wall, where it casts that familiar amber glow each evening. but tonight it pulses from somewhere deeper, somewhere that makes my teeth ache. The buzzing started again this morning, not the refrigerator, not the power lines outside, something closer, like it's coming from inside my skull just behind my left ear. When I press my palm against that spot, the sound grows fainter but never disappears completely. The skin there feels warm, warmer than the rest of my body, and sometimes I catch myself scratching until it's raw. There were lights behind the trees. I remember fragments of sleep that don't feel like sleep. Moments when I'm lying in bed, but also standing in my kitchen, watching steam rise from a cup of coffee I never made. The steam moves wrong, spiraling in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes. When I blink, I'm back in bed, sheets damp with perspiration that smells metallic, sharp, like coins left in the rain. The window across the street is dark now, but I can still see that wrong light burning behind my eyelids. It leaves an afterimage that shifts and breathes, pulsing in rhythm with something I can't identify. My heartbeat feels too slow, too deliberate, as if something else is setting the tempo. I don't remember ever coming back. Yesterday I found myself in the hallway outside my apartment, key in hand, but I have no memory of leaving. The hallway smelled different, charged with that same metallic scent that clings to my sheets. The fluorescent light above flickered in a pattern that seemed almost like code, 3 short pulses followed by 2 long ones, repeating until I forced myself to look away. The buzzing in my skull grows stronger when I try to remember. It's protecting me from something, I think, keeping certain thoughts locked away where they can't surface completely. But fragments leak through anyway, sensory ghosts that make my skin crawl with recognition I can't place. The noise didn't come from outside. I've started keeping a journal, but the entries don't make sense when I read them back. Words I don't remember writing, descriptions of places I've never been. The handwriting looks like mine but feels foreign, like someone else guided my hand while I slept. One entry simply reads, "The air tastes like copper and waiting." Copper and waiting, the phrase makes something twist in my stomach, a recognition that goes deeper than memory. I've tasted that air before, breathed it in until my lungs burned with its strange weight, but when, where, I cannot say. The light in the wrong corner flickers again, though the window remains closed. I watch it pulse 3 times, pause, then pulse twice more. The same pattern as the hallway fluorescent, the same rhythm that's been echoing in my dreams for weeks now. My skin begins to tingle, starting at my fingertips and spreading up my arms like electricity seeking ground. Time feels elastic tonight, stretching and contracting in ways that make me question whether I'm still standing at my window or somewhere else entirely. The street below seems too quiet, too empty, as if the world has paused to listen for something that hasn't arrived yet. There were lights behind the trees, moving in formation. The memory surfaces without warning, clear and sharp as broken glass. Lights that weren't stars, weren't planes, weren't anything I could name. They moved with purpose through the branches, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. I was standing in a field I don't recognize, grass wet against my bare ankles, watching those lights dance their impossible dance. But I live in the city. There are no fields here, no trees tall enough to hide lights that bright. The memory must be false, a dream that's convinced itself it's real. Yet my feet remember the cold earth, the way the grass tickled between my toes, the smell of ozone building in the air like a storm about to break. The buzzing intensifies, pushing the memory back into darkness where it belongs. My hands shake as I grip the windowsill, knuckles white with effort. The light across the street pulses faster now, urgent, insistent, calling to something deep in my chest that wants to answer. I don't remember walking to the window. I don't remember when night fell so completely. The street lamps cast their usual yellow glow, but the shadows between them seem deeper than they should be, alive with movement that stops whenever I try to focus on it directly. My reflection in the glass looks wrong, distorted in ways that have nothing to do with the window's imperfections. My eyes appear darker, wider, as if they're trying to take in more light than human eyes should need. When I raise my hand to touch my face, my reflection moves a fraction of a second too late, creating a doubling effect that makes my stomach lurch. The noise didn't come from outside, it came from within. I understand now why the buzzing feels so intimate, so close. It's not in my ear at all. It's in my bones, my blood, vibrating at a frequency that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. Something is trying to tune me, adjust my frequency to match something else, something that waits in the spaces between seconds. The light across the street goes out suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. But the afterimage remains, burning brighter than ever behind my eyes. It's not just light anymore, it's presence, awareness, something vast and patient that has been watching me watch it all along. I step back from the window, but my feet feel disconnected from my body, moving through air thick as water. The apartment around me seems to shift and breathe, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, floor tilting at angles that shouldn't exist. I reach for the light switch, but my hand passes through it as if it's made of smoke. There were lights behind the trees, and I walked toward them. The memory completes itself despite the buzzing's protests. I walked across that impossible field, grass giving way to soil that felt warm and alive beneath my feet. The lights descended as I approached, growing larger, more complex, revealing patterns within patterns that made my mind ache with their beauty and wrongness. Something touched me there in that place that might have been a dream but feels more real than my own apartment. Touched me and changed me and sent me back with gaps in my memory and a buzzing in my skull that never stops. I can feel those changes now, spreading through my body like slow fire, rewriting me from the inside out. The window across the street opens with its familiar creak, but the sound is wrong, distorted, as if it's traveling through water or vacuum. The light flickers on again, not in the wrong corner this time, but everywhere at once, filling the room with illumination that casts no shadows. I don't remember ever coming back, but I'm still leaving. Time folds in on itself, and I'm standing at the window again, watching dusk settle over the street. The window across from me closes with its distinct sound, a gentle creak followed by a faint thud, but something has changed in the repetition, a subtle shift that makes my skin crawl with anticipation. The light flickers on in the wrong corner, and I know I've been here before, will be here again, caught in a loop that tightens with each iteration. The buzzing in my skull grows louder, more insistent, tuning me to frequencies that human ears were never meant to receive. Tonight, as I watch, the window closes as usual, but this time I understand what I'm really seeing. Not a window at all, but an eye, vast and patient, watching me watch it across an impossible distance that might be measured in inches or light years. The air tastes like copper and waiting, and somewhere in the darkness behind the trees, lights are beginning to move. Story 10. The worn chain slipped silently through my fingers. Its cool, metallic scent lingered on my skin as I stepped back, a subtle reminder of forgotten things. The room was still, filled with the charged quiet that follows a decision made too late. This stillness reached out, wrapping around my senses, and left a faint tremor in the air. Somewhere beneath the veneer of calm, a shift had begun. The chain no longer felt like it belonged. I've been holding this chain for 3 weeks now, turning it over in my palm, feeling its weight. It appeared in my jacket pocket after that night I can't quite remember. The night that left gaps in my memory like missing pages torn from a book. I know something happened. My body knows. There's a persistent ache in my left shoulder, a sensitivity to certain frequencies of sound, and this strange habit I've developed of checking over my shoulder when I'm alone. The chain is ordinary enough. Silver-plated links, maybe 6 inches long with a small clasp at one end. But when I hold it, my pulse quickens. Not fear exactly, more like recognition without understanding, like hearing a song you know you've never heard before. I've started keeping a voice recorder. My therapist suggested it might help piece together the fragmented memories. What she doesn't know is that I'm not just recording my thoughts. I'm documenting the things that don't make sense, the sounds that only I seem to hear, the way my reflection sometimes appears to be looking in a different direction. This morning I found something else, a small digital file on my phone buried deep in a folder I don't remember creating. The timestamp shows it was recorded that night, the night I can't remember. My thumb hovers over the play button, trembling slightly. The phone feels heavier than it should. The audio begins with static, not the clean white noise of an empty recording, but something organic, like breathing through fabric. Then my own voice, distant and hollow, as if I'm speaking from the bottom of a well. "It's starting again," I hear myself say. The lights are moving in patterns now. 3 short bursts, then a long, steady beam. They're not random. I don't remember saying those words. I don't remember any lights. The recording continues. There's a sound in the background, electronic but wrong somehow, like a dial tone played backwards through water. My voice comes again, closer now, more urgent. Something's behind me. I can feel it watching. The air smells different here, like new plastic and cold blood. The file cuts off abruptly. The silence that follows feels thick, expectant. I play it again, and this time I notice something else. In the static between my words, there's a rhythm, a pattern that makes my teeth ache. As I listen, the chain in my other hand begins to vibrate, subtle at first, then stronger. The metal grows warm against my palm, pulsing in time with the electronic noise from the recording. My reflection in the dark phone screen shows someone I almost recognize, someone who looks like they're listening to something I can't hear. The first memory fragment comes without warning. I'm standing in a room I've never seen before, but my feet know where to step. The floor is concrete, painted white, but the paint is peeling in long strips that curl like dead skin. There are windows, but they show nothing. Not darkness, not light, just nothing. The absence of anything to see. I'm holding something in my hand, not the chain, something else. Something that hums with a frequency I can feel in my bones. The walls around me are covered with cables, thick black cords that snake from floor to ceiling, pulsing with their own rhythm. They look like veins under pale skin. The memory dissolves before I can grasp it fully, leaving only the taste of copper in my mouth and the certainty that I was not alone in that room. I decide to search my apartment more thoroughly. In the back of my closet, behind clothes I haven't worn in months, I find a small box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, is a piece of metal, triangular, about the size of my palm, with edges too sharp to be accidental. It's warm to the touch, despite being hidden away. When I hold it up to the light, it doesn't cast a shadow. The object fits perfectly in my hand, as if it was made for me, or as if I was made for it. As I turn it over, examining its surface, another fragment surfaces. I'm in a corridor now, walking toward a door that seems to move further away with each step. The walls are lined with mirrors, but they don't show my reflection. Instead, they show the same room I was in before, the white room with the peeling paint from different angles. In some of the mirrors, I can see myself standing there, but I'm facing the wrong direction. I'm looking at something that isn't there. The corridor stretches endlessly ahead, but I can hear my footsteps behind me, as if someone is following, matching my pace exactly. When I stop, the footsteps continue for just a moment longer. When I turn around, there's only more corridor, more mirrors showing that white room where another version of me stands perfectly still. The fragment ends, but this time the disorientation lingers. I'm sitting in my living room, but for a moment I can still smell that antiseptic air, still feel the smooth floor beneath feet that aren't quite my own. My phone buzzes, a text message from a number I don't recognize. Did you find it? I stare at the screen. The message shows as delivered 3 minutes ago, but I've been holding my phone the entire time. It never buzzed. I never heard the notification sound, yet there it is. I type back, find what? The response comes immediately, what you were holding. My grip tightens on the triangular piece of metal. It's grown warmer, and I can swear I feel it pulse like a heartbeat. I look at the chain on the table beside me. It's moving slightly, sliding across the wood surface toward the metal object in my hand. Another text, you're remembering now, that's good, but be careful what you remember. I try to call the number, but it goes straight to a disconnection message. The number is no longer in service. When I check my message history, the conversation is gone, but I can still feel the weight of those words, the certainty that someone is watching my progress. The room around me feels different now. The shadows fall at wrong angles, and there's a sound coming from the walls themselves. A low humming that seems to respond to my heartbeat. When I move toward the window, my reflection in the glass shows me standing in that white room again. This time, I'm not alone. There's a figure behind me in the reflection, just at the edge of visibility. Tall, motionless, with features that blur when I try to focus on them. In the reflection, I'm holding the chain and the metal object, but they're connected now, forming something I don't understand, something that casts light instead of shadow. I turn away from the window, but the humming grows louder. It's coming from inside my head now, matching the frequency of whatever I was holding in that first memory. The sound builds until it's almost unbearable, and then suddenly I'm there again. The white room, but this time I can see everything. The cables on the walls aren't cables at all. They're something else, something that moves with purpose, reaching toward me with deliberate intent. The windows don't show nothing, they show everything. Every moment, every possibility playing simultaneously like broken television screens. In one window I see myself as a child. In another I see myself as I am now, standing in my living room staring at my reflection. In a third I see myself in this white room, but different somehow. Changed. The figure behind me steps closer. I can't turn around to look at it directly, but I know it's there. I can feel its presence like cold breath on the back of my neck. It speaks, but not with words. The meaning appears directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. You chose to remember, it tells me, but memory is a door that opens both ways. I'm holding something new now, not the chain, not the metal triangle, but something that incorporates both. Something that feels alive in my hands, warm and pulsing and aware. The object shows me things, flashes of understanding that hurt to comprehend. I see myself making a choice. I see myself agreeing to something I can't quite grasp. I see myself walking willingly into that white room, carrying something precious that I was meant to deliver. But the memory fractures before I can understand what I carried or why I agreed to forget. The fragment ends abruptly, leaving me gasping on my living room floor. The chain and the metal object are still in my hands, but they've changed. They're connected now, fused together in a way that seems impossible. The new configuration pulses with its own light, and when I look at it directly, I can see through it to somewhere else. Somewhere that might be that white room, or might be somewhere far worse. My phone buzzes again. Another message from the disconnected number. The door is opening. Are you ready to go back? I want to say no. I want to throw the object away, delete the messages, pretend none of this is happening. But I know it's too late for that. The memories are coming faster now, overlapping and contradicting each other. I remember walking into that white room. I remember never leaving it. I remember making a choice, and I remember having no choice at all. The walls of my apartment are beginning to look familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl. The paint is starting to peel in long, curling strips. The windows are showing less and less of the world outside, more and more of something else entirely. I record one final voice memo, though I'm not sure why. If someone finds this, I hear myself saying, if someone is listening to this, then you need to know that the choice isn't really a choice. You think you're remembering something that happened to you, but you're not. You're becoming something that was always supposed to happen. The chain, the metal, the white room, they're not memories, they're instructions. My voice sounds different on the recording, calmer, more certain, like someone who has finally understood something terrible and beautiful and inevitable. The door opens both ways, my recorded voice continues, and something has been waiting on the other side for a very long time. Something that looks like you, sounds like you, remembers being you, but isn't you, not anymore. The recording ends, but I don't remember making it. The voice sounds like mine, but the words feel foreign in my mouth. The object in my hands is growing brighter now, casting shadows that move independently of any light source. In those shadows, I can see the white room clearly. The figure is still there, waiting patiently. It has my face now. Outside, the world continues as if nothing has changed. But inside, in this space between memory and forgetting, between choosing and being chosen, something fundamental has shifted. The chain no longer feels like it belongs to me. It feels like I belong to it. And somewhere in the static between stations, between thoughts, between one heartbeat and the next, I can hear it calling me home.